Okay, I think that works now. Hi, everyone. So I want to give us some general conceptual background in current discussions in philosophy of AI and machine learning. This is just one of the talks I give, but gives us some kind of shared background, shared common language in how philosophy is approaching and engaging with AI and machine learning today. So I thought this would be a good kind of general introduction. So I'm going to try to convince you today that the way we kind of conceptualize of AI culturally has become associated with a bad idea of what scientific objectivity or objectivity in general is. And that by engaging with and critiquing with this kind of false ideal of objectivity for AI or ML, we can kind of come to better understand what objectivity ought to be. There's a popular narrative today that AI is revolutionizing everything from labor markets to how we create and consume art, to how we get therapy, to how do we engage in warfare, to how we do science, etc. And in most contexts where what we are doing is automating human labor, there's a narrative about AI replacing humans, not only because it's cost effective, not only because it is potentially more efficient than people, but because it's more objective than people across domains. So a smattering of examples. In therapy, there's the idea that AI is less subject to bias, that it's objective. This was a survey of students. But the academic paper in which this was written affirms that the students are recognizing the objectivity of AI. Similarly, AI in healthcare, AI in therapy is taken to be a beacon of objectivity. In criminal justice, etc., we see AI as, again, hailed as a beacon of objectivity. AI algorithms provide more objective and complete analyses of things like recidivism risk. The integration of AI is a shift from subjective analysis towards more objective, reproducible approaches. And then our newly retitled Department of Defense, which is now the Department of War, wants us to know that they're trying to ensure that our military has objective mission-first systems that will guarantee decision superiority and warfighting advantage in this AI era. Similarly, they want to ensure that their AI systems are devoid of social ideology, and that this social ideology that AI systems might be indoctrinated with interferes with their ability to produce objectively truthful responses. Interestingly, I think it's important to note that according to briefs put out by our government, we have to indoctrinate AI systems. We have to add some special extra sauce to AI systems to make them ideological, which perverts them from their true default operation, which is one of providing access to objective truth. So objectivity is just part of how AI systems function according to our government. So I'm gonna make the kind of bold claim that objectivity, in some sense, is essential to our folk concept of AI. What do I mean by a folk concept? So this is a notion from philosophy that there are folk concepts, which is the sort of intuitive, non-expert, shared cultural understanding of what something is. And then there are expert concepts. So in science and engineering, there's an expert version of the concept. So there's a folk concept of what consciousness is, and then there's how philosophers think of consciousness, and then there's how scientists think of consciousness, things like this. There's how the psychiatric community thinks of psychosis, and then there's our folk concept of psychosis, right? So I think AI, as we understand it as a folk concept, has objectivity as a kind of core essential element to it. But the way we culturally understand something can feed back into how expert communities understand something. And so my contention is that this folk concept of AI as inherently objective has fed back into how expert communities in science, engineering, and even philosophy understand AI. I think in the arena of science, this is maybe most readily apparent. It's made explicit, whereas in most places it's implicit. I also think it's most readily debunked in the arena of AI for science. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But because the way we use AI systems is kind of quasi-scientific in most places, I think we get to extend these conclusions potentially to uses of AI in more general contexts. Before we get any further, I just want to clarify that what I mean by AI is machine learning. If we rewound the clock 20 years, AI meant something different. There's been a lot of semantic drift of what we mean by AI. I think we're verging on nowadays AI just is LLMs or AI just is generative AI. I'm specifying that we mean machine learning writ large here. ML, for those who don't know, is basically just automating statistical analysis. It's statistics where a statistical model is parameterized from data via an algorithm. We tried for a long time to create a version of AI, and it seems like suddenly now AI is ubiquitous. That's not because we suddenly created a novel technology overnight, but rather because we have sort of retroactively named a sort of basic computer technology that's pretty ubiquitous nowadays for telling you what Spotify song you want to listen to next or what underwear ad you're going to get on Instagram or what have you. We now call that AI, right? But I want to say also that science in a kind of basic caricatured form is also learning about the world from empirical data. And in that sense, when we use machine learning on natural data, we're doing something that at least mimics the kind of general form of what science is. For this reason, philosophers of AI have started to refer to AI or machine learning as a kind of epistemic technology, meaning it's a technology that at its core functions to provide knowledge about the world. So far I've told you that our folk concept of AI is this, and a little bit more about what AI actually is, namely machine learning. I'm now going to tell you a bit about objectivity, both what it isn't and what it might be or ought to be. So what do we mean by objectivity? Does anyone have inclinations about what core ingredients are for objectivity?
Something that can be understood by everyone in the same way?
Yes, interoperability. Yeah, definitely.
Maybe from first principles, so doesn't assume very much.
Yes, minimizing starting assumptions. Yeah, so these are some conceptions of objectivity. Importantly, it's defined relative to subjectivity. So we know it's not subjectivity. A lot of people say that objectivity ought to be capturing reality, truth to fact, capturing the way things are independent from individual perspectives on them or independent from maybe what we think of as arbitrary features of group perspectives on them, freedom from bias. In philosophy of science, we sometimes think of knowledge produced by reliable processes as objective, removal of arbitrariness, again, from the depictions we get of reality. But so philosophy has engaged with various ideas of objectivity. And philosophy of science has critiqued a number of kind of false ideals of what objectivity can be understood as. These include a view from nowhere kind of view of objectivity, like a perspective without perspective. The idea that it's truth to fact has sometimes come under critique for being maybe viciously circular. So it's, any kind of epistemic success condition, unless we believe we kind of have raw, unfiltered access to reality. To define an epistemic success condition like truth or knowledge or objectivity, we're going to have a kind of circular definition because we don't have access to that perspectiveless perspective that tells us whether our science is actually getting at truth, right? Science is the means we get at truth. So we're going to have a kind of circular definition of any epistemic success condition like objectivity. But those can be viciously circular in a way that they're non-explanatory, or they can be virtuously circular in that it's a kind of definition that points back at itself, but it doesn't necessarily not provide explanation in pointing back at itself. Importantly, when we go after conceptually incoherent notions of objectivity, when that's the kind of goal we're pursuing for science, and we know it to be unattainable because it's conceptually incoherent, this can kind of lead us astray epistemically. So there's a sort of theory of objectivity as value freedom that is a kind of meta-narrative that we get throughout the history of what we call modern science. Objectivity is freedom from human values. And in fact, I think basically all of the conceptions we have of objectivity today in modernity come about around the time of the scientific revolution. Writings in Bacon, writing in Newton are sort of credited with giving us the blueprint for our modern scientific method and the blueprint for a modern conception of objectivity. And in fact, a kind of roughly modern conception of scientific objectivity is what demarcates, I claim at least, I think a lot of people would agree, what we call modern science. So modern science comes about when we arrive at something in the ballpark of our modern conception of scientific objectivity. When Newton says in the General Scholium of the Principia, hypotheses non fingo, I do not feign hypotheses, he's saying, look, there's a way that we've been doing science for a long time. It's kind of scholastic Aristotelian in the way it uses math. It's kind of the paradigm at the time that Newton was working, this sort of background paradigm was new mechanism. And he's saying, this is a way that we presuppose things about nature, and then lo and behold, we find the things that we have presupposed about nature in nature. And I don't want to do that. I want to proceed from the facts, right? And make them general by induction. An idea of objectivity as freedom from human values dates back to Francis Bacon with the Novum Organum. But that wasn't the only ideal of objectivity that Bacon was promoting. He also promoted an idea of objectivity as freedom from theoretical bias, theory freedom, or alleged neutrality with respect to theory. These are defining features of his notion of objectivity. According to some historians of science, these are the defining theories of his notion of objectivity. Interestingly, we've discussed in philosophy for the last 50 years a value-free ideal of science, but we haven't talked about a theory-free ideal. And I'm going to propose that what is at work in claims that AI is objective in some new and special way is what I'm going to call a theory-free ideal for scientific objectivity.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question? What do you mean by theory here?
Yeah, I'm using it in a kind of both generic and minimal sense of we bring our concepts to bear on things. Great question. In philosophy of science, we use it in several technical ways in various sciences. I mean, in what we mean by theory in like physics is very different from what we mean by theory in psychology, let's say. But here I'm using it in a very simplistic sense of, are we bringing our concepts to bear on what we are pursuing in science such that those concepts that we start with shape the outcomes of what we are doing, shape the kind of knowledge that results from what we're pursuing.
So would you say an equation is a theory in this case?
I would not. I would consider an equation as something that encodes elements of theory, but it's a representational scheme that enables us to investigate the world incorporating theory. So it's more on the side of a model, maybe. So yeah, claims of objectivity in machine learning have this specific form in the context of AI and science. These are claims to the effect that machine learning or AI is enabling us to do science with no theory or minimal theory. So the Royal Society and the Alan Turing Institute talk about an AI revolution in science. For many years now, we've been hearing about how ML and big data make the scientific method obsolete because it's the end of theory and we don't need any theory to do machine learning. And we're witnessing the dawn of post-theory science. And these are kind of caricatured, like these are hard to take seriously. But I think in a less caricatured form, these ideas have infiltrated how scientists, engineers, and philosophers are thinking about AI and science. So a kind of sociology of science paper surveyed who they identified as leaders across several scientific fields, who said that AI will prompt unforeseen outcomes, reframe disciplines, reframe modes and methods of knowledge production. AI could bypass traditional means of knowledge production. That the difference between traditional and AI-based methods is that traditional methods are hypothesis or theory-driven, whereas machine learning-based science is kind of data-driven in a way that differentiates it from being hypothesis or theory-driven. And then philosophers have also claimed similar things, or at least are discussing similar things. Some of them are more neutral with respect to these claims. But there are philosophers who endorse these claims as well, talking about post-theory science and the epistemically new frontier raised by data science, the theory-free paradigm in science methodology, claims that theory at the level of how knowledge produced and structured is being replaced by information stored in databases too large to read and processed by algorithms too complex to understand, which could lead to a permanent change in the way science is pursued. Similarly, machine learning in science contrasts with traditional scientific modeling, where we use explicit theories. Machine learning models are constructed based on data instead of theoretical assumptions about the target system. They reach predictions without theoretical backup that supplements data with causal interpretation, et cetera. These are what philosophers are saying about machine learning in science. So can AI or machine learning in science be theory-free? Spoiler, I think the answer is no. But before we get there, we have to have a detour through the problem of induction. So machine learning is induction. It's a kind of inductive inference. Specifically, it's enumerative induction because it's tallying up things and extrapolating. You may have heard of the problem of induction. from the 18th century philosopher David Hume. How do we generalize to universals from particulars? If the aim of science is to generalize to universals or to be able to infer causation, how do we get there? We can observe a raven, we can observe 100 ravens, we can observe 1,000 ravens, but how do we know that all ravens are black? Couldn't there be white ravens, right? Similarly, we can observe that when I pick this up and I let go, it falls, right? But we're not observing causation, right? That's something that has to be inferred from observation. Importantly, inductive inference is a kind of ampliative inference, meaning that we have to add ingredients to it. We get out of it a cake that has more than the ingredients we put in. And importantly, we're going beyond what is deductively licensed from what is evidentially available. And the point is that in our basic philosophical conception of inductive inference, we need conceptual resources to get induction off the ground. So I see an apple. I want to know if I can eat it, if it's not going to poison me. I've eaten 1,000 apples before and they haven't poisoned me. The kind of traditional way we're taught the problem of induction is, how do I know this apple, this thing in front of me which I know to be an apple, will not poison me given that I've eaten 1,000 apples before and they haven't poisoned me? How do I know that tomorrow the sun will rise just because every previous day I've woken up and the sun has risen? Hume, importantly, actually puts the skepticism much earlier on in the process. How do I categorize my experience? I have raw sensory experience. How do I categorize this thing as an apple, right? What's that? Is that fruit? Is that an apple? Are these fruits? Is this an apple? Probably that's an apple. No, this is manchineal. It's a death apple. It'll kill you. We need a rich concept of what an apple is to even be able to say this is an instance of thing X and not an instance of thing Y, right? We need to know that these things are not apples. A similar picture kind of emerges in science. In order to differentiate between the kind of blooming, buzzing confusion, as James called it, of sensory experience, we need to impose concepts on reality, right? We need to impose concepts on our experience for it to not just be the kind of sensory overload that an infant would experience, right? And to pick out what in our experience corresponds to whatever the object of study is, whatever the phenomena of interest is that we're doing science in order to learn about, we need concepts of that phenomena. Okay, so we build instruments of measure, right? And we might say, okay, well, those exist independently from us. They're just out there collecting data on their own, so they must not be theory-mediated. Well, they're built encoding our concepts in them, right? We specifically design our instruments so that they can pick out things that we want to know about. And they are imposing conceptual structure on the kind of raw stuff of the world in order to make measurements. For instance, we need to cool our sensors to a particular temperature such that the thing of interest, the signal that we want to appear as a signal, appears as a signal and can be differentiated from all this potential thermal noise, right? Researchers in Australia had a telescope aimed at deep space, and since the 90s they were trying to record deep space signals, and they kept finding this mysterious high power energy signature. And they were like, oh my God, it's aliens, for decades. In like 2015, they were like, it's are researchers opening the microwave when they are microwaving their lunch in the lab? Right? Without having rich concepts of what different signals might mean, right? Opening the microwave is communication from alien races. We have to have the right theoretical resources to know what data represent. And importantly, data are not the world. Data are not the phenomena. Data are representations of measurement. They're usually symbolic representations. Like, we're usually talking about quantitative data, right? So it's usually symbolic representations of the results of measurement or observation of hopefully the phenomena we want to be measuring or observing, right? We have to have a theory or concept of what data represent in order for them to be informative at all. In machine learning, we have supervised learning, and in supervised learning, right, what you're learning is very obviously, in some sense, human concepts, right? I have a data set where over here we have precancerous scans, right? And over here we have benign scans that represent tissues that are benign or cancerous, right? And I, expert physician, oncologist, have labeled them. Okay, so we train a machine learning system, we train some deep learning to be able to classify, oh, this is cancerous, this is precancerous, this is benign. Great. Okay, it's learned our concept of what is cancer. Unsupervised learning works differently. You're not learning the human label directly. And so you might say, okay, well, we're not, well, what are we, I mean, it's just learning from the data. It's not learning our concepts. Well, it's able to learn from the data because the data is richly shaped by our concepts. For instance, we might be segmenting the same cancer images. We want to know why it is that the deep learning system picked up on this and not that, right? So we ask it to segment the images. Well, how we ask it to segment the images, of course, encodes what we're looking for in some sense, but also, right, what we've measured, the way we've tuned our medical instruments, the way we've sliced the biopsy, right? Like, these are all shaped by what it is we're trying to learn and how we think of it, right? Again, unsupervised learning is still just as much as supervised learning, learning from our concepts. It might not be learning our concepts, right? Something fascinating we find in deep learning is sometimes it's learning sort of weird alien concepts. Like, we teach it to differentiate cheetahs from tigers, and we're like, oh yeah, it's got our cheetah and tiger concept. And it's like when we kind of like probe it to ask it what it's learning, it's like, no, it has a really fine-grained like understanding of pixel density, and that's its concept of what a cheetah is. It's not our concept of a cheetah. But in general, they learn only in virtue of data being shaped by our concepts. Yeah, we did that. So I've argued so far that the belief among working scientists, among engineers, and even among philosophers and the general public that AI or machine learning can be theory-free, that we can do science with ML that's theory-free, are best explained by a sort of false ideal of scientific objectivity that I call a theory-free ideal. According to this theory-free ideal, scientific objectivity is achieved by eliminating or at least minimizing theoretical input on our scientific methods or our scientific results. And I think the theory-free ideal of objectivity and our kind of folk concept of AI are mutually reinforcing ideas. There are two faces of theory freedom, much as there are two faces of value freedom. I think that there's a kind of version of these ideals of objectivity that we would all kind of readily assent to. If I'm a big cigarette company and my human value is maximize profit, and I go fund researchers saying, I think you should find out that cancer is not caused by cigarette smoking, right? Slide them some money under the table. We would say, okay, that's not an appropriate way for values to influence how we do science. Lo and behold, they find that cancer is not caused by cigarette smoking. Surprise, surprise. Right? We would say that's not an appropriate way for values to influence science. Therefore, if the value-free ideal just means don't put values into science in an inappropriate way, then that's, I think, quite kosher, and we would all agree to it. Similarly, if I have a geocentric conception of our universe, if I just know it to be the case that the planets revolve around the Earth, and I go and collect astronomical data in conformity to my knowledge that the planets revolve around the Earth, right, and interpret it thus, we would say, again, that's an inappropriate way for theory to come in. That's question begging. We don't want our science to be question begging. And so in some sense, if the lesson is just don't let values and theories inappropriately influence our methods or our results in science, then of course this is correct. But importantly, there's a dark side to the theory-free ideal. When we insist that scientific results are not shaped at all by theory, that there's none of our concepts, none of our assumptions went into our results at all, we end up making those concepts that shaped the research, that shaped the results we got and how we interpreted it. We make them a part of what we've discovered about the world. We make them sort of part of our empirical reality. Because, of course, the concepts, the theory have to be there. We can't do science, we can't do induction without theoretical resources coming to bear. Importantly, it's a kind of reification of our assumptions. We take something that isn't real and we make it real. To help us understand this, I'm going to introduce a concept from medieval philosophy. The medieval philosophers, mostly Thomas Aquinas, differentiated between a de re, which is of the thing, and a de dicto, which is of dictum, like of what is said. So there are properties, there are predicates that apply to what's said or a representational scheme, and then there are properties of the thing that the representational scheme represents. I think part of the difficult work of doing science with models, with math, with computational methods, with machine learning, is being able to differentiate between what's just an arbitrary feature of the model we used and what is actually in the world. So reification or reification is making something that's properly interpreted as de dicto into de re. It's something that's properly interpreted as an artifact of our modeling and treating it as part of the world. Literally, Latin, it's like thingifying. It's thingifying something that's a non-thing. That's just an assumption. That's just a feature of a representational scheme. It's mistaking the math for the territory is my kind of cute lingo for it. Or aspects of our starting assumptions for empirical discoveries. And I think when we pursue an ideal of science as objective qua theory-free, we take that theoretical influence and we hide it from ourselves. And we therefore reify that theory as kind of inevitably part of what we're discovering. So in the sciences, we're increasingly using deep learning, we're increasingly doing other methods that are doing kind of like nonlinear PCA or dimensionality reduction, like, I don't know, like TSNE or UMAP are kind of popular approaches now. And we're discovering that the data has manifolds in it. Now, of course, it's natural data. And natural data, we can learn from it because it's patterned. And we're doing massively over-parameterized models. When we talk about big data, we're talking about data sets that have extremely high N, extremely high D. So it's sort of, in a sense, tautological that we're going to find that the data are actually sampled when we do DR, when we do dimensionality reduction, that the data are sampled from a lower D manifold, right? It has to be there. If there's structure in the data, and if it's not 1,000 dimensional in actuality, which of course, like, if it's structure and it's structure that we can learn, it's not going to be. It has to be there. But increasingly, I'm seeing across disciplines claims that the existence of the manifold is kind of explanatory of some feature of, like, organic molecules, for instance, or some feature of neural population. You know, in neural populations, right, it's not impossible that the manifold is actually doing explanatory work because it's actually doing computational work in the brain. But in organic molecules, we know that the manifold isn't doing computational work, right? It's an artifact of a mode of statistical analysis on a certain type of data. So I think this is a kind of example of ways that our machine learning gets reified in the sciences as well. I've critiqued a sense of objectivity in science as theory freedom that I believe to be in error and potentially problematically misleading. It might lead us to do science in a way that reifies our assumptions into reality. If objectivity in science is about differentiating between human biases and assumptions and the reality in the world independent from them, if it's about differentiating between, like, arbitrary features of how we do science, how we represent the results of our science, of models and theories, and then true discoveries about nature, then I think avoiding reification is an essential component of objectivity in science. Importantly, I think this is an aspect of objectivity that, to date, neither philosophers nor scientists have really appreciated as crucial to objectivity. It simply doesn't get discussed. And in order to achieve this kind of objectivity is freedom from reification, right? We need to have conceptual hygiene. We need to do intricate and elaborate and painstaking conceptual work, right? And that informs how we collect data, that informs our experimental design, that informs how we build models, how we interpret models, etc. So in some sense, to achieve scientific objectivity, I think we have to do philosophy. I think we as scientists and engineers have to engage to some extent in the work of doing philosophy about the science and engineering that we are doing. That's my conclusion. But I think, although I've talked today about this specific ideal of objectivity in the specific context of AI in science, that there are important ways in which this can kind of extrapolate to the mythological conception of AI as objective writ large. I think the folk concept of AI as an inherently objective technology or as an inherently objective epistemic tool motivates a lot of applications of AI in the real world, especially those where we're replacing human expertise with an automated system, right? I think this also includes places where there are really high stakes outcomes for people that result from the use of AI systems, right? Therapy, warfare, criminal justice, medicine, welfare allocation, fraud detection, right, etc. I don't want to thank everyone.